Gregorio Allegri's Miserere Me Deus is a staple of Western church music. Fans of Dante will appreciate it as the musical setting of Psalm 51, 50 of the Vulgate, which plays a major role for the penitents in Canto 5 of the Purgatorio. Fans of music will appreciate Allegri's masterpiece as a magisterial demonstration of polyphonic music. Polyphony is the simultaneous playing of distinct melodies. It's this interplay between the independent melodic lines that, when combined, produces a rich and powerful musical texture. Quality poetry, I'd say, is somewhat polyphonic in nature, and that the best poetry will draw upon independent literary devices in order to produce a rich and powerful linguistic texture. William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 8 affords us a perfect example of what we might call poetic polyphony. In this video lesson, we're going to look into exactly how this is achieved. I'm Brian E. Denton, and this is ELA+. Welcome. In this video lesson, the first thing we're going to do is read Sonnet No. 8. After that, we'll move right into our analysis. Our analysis will proceed on a quatrain by quatrain basis, and what we're going to do is examine how Shakespeare, like a polyphonic composer, draws upon independent literary devices in order to produce a coherent poetic whole. As always, we'll conclude with some comprehension questions. For those of you who have been reading along with us in this series, you know that the first thing we'd like to do is read the poems to ourselves and then read the poems together aloud. For those of you who have not been with us so far, first, welcome, and second, you might want to check out our video lesson, How to Read a Poem. It's linked to down in the description. That video lesson is going to teach you how to read a poem intelligently. So once you've watched that, read Sonnet No. 8 to yourself, and then read the poem aloud, which is exactly what we're going to do right now. Music to hear. Why hearest thou music sadly? Sweets with sweets war not. Joy delights in joy. Why lovest thou that which thou receivest not gladly, or else receivest with pleasure thine annoy? If the true concord of well-tuned sounds, by unions married, do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who all in one pleasing note do sing, whose speechless song, being many, seeming one, sings this to thee, thou single wilt prove none. So that's William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 8. Now typically in these video lessons, this is the part of the video where I paraphrase the poem for you and provide for you on a quatrain by quatrain basis a plain English contemporary version of the poem. But I'm not going to do that today for reasons that will become clear as the video lesson progresses. Instead, what I'd like to do is quote from Cleanth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren's great book Understanding Poetry. Here's what those two have to say about the process of paraphrasing poetry. Message hunting, the business of looking only for the statement of an idea which the reader thinks he can apply profitably in his own conduct, is one of the most ordinary forms of general confusion. Poetry seems to give a great deal of good advice. But granting that the advice is good advice, we can still ask whether or not the poem is a good poem. If the advice is what the poem has to offer us, then we can ask why a short prose statement of this good advice is not as good as, or even better than, the poem itself. But even the people who say that they like the poem because of its message will usually prefer the poem to a plain prose statement. If such people would prefer the poem to the prose summary, they would probably also prefer it to certain other versions of the poetic statement. This passage is perfectly apropos as it pertains to the procreation sonnets in general and Sonnet No. 8 in particular. What, after all, are the procreation sonnets, if not a set of advice from the speaker to the young man? The speaker tells the young man to put aside his foolish ways and settle down and procreate, so he can pass on his beauty to future generations and also attain immortality through genetic reproduction. Okay, very well. But the speaker could have just written this sentiment in the form of a letter to the young man. But he didn't. He wrote 17 immortal poems instead. So what is it that elevates these poems above mere message? Why, after Brooks and Warren, do we prefer the poetic expression of these sentiments and not their mere paraphrase? This is the question that I hope to answer in this video lesson. So what I'm going to do on a quatrain by quatrain basis is paraphrase each quatrain and then explore how Shakespeare uses the various literary devices at his disposal in harmonic concert with these messages that he has to say in order to produce a coherent, poetic, polyphonic experience. We begin naturally with the first quatrain. I'd say a decent paraphrase of this quatrain might be something like, "You who are yourself beautiful music, why does listening to beautiful music make you feel sad? Sweet and joyful things, like yourself and music, should complement each other. So why do you love things that make you unhappy and enjoy things that are not good for you?" Okay, so what the speaker is doing here is he's setting up a contrast between the negative emotional state of the young man and the positive associations that the speaker believes that quality music should evoke. So how does Shakespeare employ the language arts or literary devices in order to elevate this simple message into the realm of poetry? I'd say he achieves this through his use of diction on the one hand and meter on the other. Let's start with diction. Diction is, simply put, word choice. What words will a writer choose in order to express his themes, his ideas, his meaning, his tone? There are 3 instances of diction in the first quatrain of Sonnet No. 8 that I'd like to draw your attention to. And note how Shakespeare uses this diction in polyphonic harmony with the message that he wishes to communicate. First, I draw your attention to the use of chiasmus in line 1. Chiasmus is when a word, a grammatical construction, or a concept is repeated, but in reverse order. So think of chiasmus as when a clause is repeated, but only the repetition is reversed. Do you see how line 1 presents us with an instance of chiasmus? We start out with these 3 words, music to hear. The word music comes first, and this is followed by the word hear. Now note the rest of the line reads in part, "Why hearest thou music sadly?" In this instance, the clauses have been reversed. We get the word hear first, and then music comes after. This is an instance of chiasmus. This chiasmus subtly establishes the reversed opposites of the quatrain's message. The young man should be happy listening to this music, but instead he's sad. It's kind of like a mirrored reflection. Keep in mind this idea of the mirrored reflection as we move forward in the poem, because it's going to come up again. In terms of diction, the second thing that you should take note of is the repetition of words in this quatrain. What Shakespeare does is he couples certain words. That is, he makes sure that certain words appear twice. The words that are repeated or coupled are music, hear, sweets, joy, and receivest. This choice of diction, this multiplicity of words, is appropriate given the themes that Shakespeare wants to communicate in this poem as a whole. As we will see in the following quatrain, the speaker believes that the young man is upset not because he's listening to upsetting music, but because the young man recognizes in the harmonic nature of the music the necessity of coupling, and that he's violating this law of nature by refusing to couple himself. So we get this coupling of words. All the words coupled, note, are of a positive association. Yes, these words all have positive associations. They all evoke positive emotional states. Music? Come on, everybody loves music. I know I do, especially music with numbers in the title, like Beethoven's Opus 127, Mozart's K551, or Wu-Tang's 36 Chambers. And the other words are also positively charged. Words like sweets, joy, and receiving. We all like to receive sweet and joyful things. The third instance of diction contributing polyphonically to the message of the quatrain are these negatively charged words. Here I'm talking about sadly and annoy. Yes, these words are negatively charged, but sadly is nullified because the speaker is saying that the young man shouldn't hear music sadly. And as it pertains to annoy, the young man receives with pleasure his annoy. Or another, perhaps more persuasive way to read these final two lines of the quatrain is to observe that, yes, we do have this negative dour diction in the last two lines. And this is to be contrasted against the positive, pleasant diction that we encountered in the first two lines. So we get the pleasantness of the music, represented in the diction of the first two lines, and then the dour, negative emotional state of the young man, represented in the diction of the concluding two lines. But what about the negative emotional state of the young man? Remember that the message of this quatrain is that there's a contrast between the negative emotional state of the young man and the positive emotions that the speaker believes the pleasant music should evoke. We've seen that Shakespeare delivers the pleasant emotions of the music through the use of pleasant diction. So what language arts, what literary devices does Shakespeare use to communicate this idea of a negative emotional state? Meter. Shakespeare uses meter to do this. So let's go ahead and look at the meter of this opening quatrain and think about how it might communicate to the reader a sense of emotional disturbance or a negative emotional resonance. Now, the first thing that you need to know is that traditionally, sonnets are written in what we call iambic pentameter. If you don't know what iambic pentameter is, that's okay. You can actually look at our video lesson, The English Sonnet, and we go very deep into what iambic pentameter is there. But for now, in a nutshell, just know that a line of iambic pentameter is 5 feet long, and each foot consists of 2 syllables, one unstressed, followed by a stressed. So every line has 10 syllables. Now that's all the form or mechanics of iambic pentameter. There's also the phonesthetics of iambic pentameter to consider. The rhythm of iambic pentameter is a rhythm of a flowing, natural, and musical nature. It's this musicality that is the reason precisely why poets employ iambic pentameter to write their sonnets. Sonnets, remember, come from the Italian sonetto, meaning little song. So right now you might be asking yourself, Brian, why are you talking about the pleasing nature of iambic pentameter when what you said previously is that this quatrain, metrically speaking, is trying to communicate to the reader the young man's negative emotional state? Well, the answer to that question is simple. In this opening quatrain, Shakespeare violates every convention, metrically speaking, of the sonnet. He almost abandons iambic pentameter completely. That is, he disturbs the format. Let's take a closer look. Here we see the metrical breakdown of this first quatrain. As you can clearly see, this is not iambic pentameter. And I should say that of all the sonnets in this sonnet cycle, sonnet number 8 might be the most difficult poem to perform scansion on. It's just so odd. The rules are all broken. And like I said, this is probably intentional on Shakespeare's part. The first thing you're going to notice is that the opening line is 11 syllables long, not the 10 that we're expecting. When a line of poetry exceeds the expected amount of syllables, it's called hypermetrical. We have a hypermetrical line right here, right off the bat, so already things are off. Things are disturbed. So to reiterate, already the quatrain is disturbed metrically, just like the young man's mind, according to the speaker, is disturbed. Looking closer at this first line, we see that aside from being hypermetrical, it also begins with a trochee. A trochee is a two-syllable foot consisting of one stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. A trochee, therefore, is the opposite of an iamb. The word music is a trochee because the stress falls on the first syllable and not the second. There are a few things to note about trochees in poetry. First, what we have here is called a trochaic substitution. A trochaic substitution is when a poet substitutes in a trochee for an iamb. Now, the trochaic substitution is actually a very common occurrence in poetry. So if this were the only metrical anomaly in this quatrain, then it really would not support at all my theory that Shakespeare is having the speaker speak in a metrically disturbed fashion so as to represent the young man's disturbed mind. But, as we'll see, this trochaic substitution is far from the only metrical disturbance that we see in this quatrain, and indeed, in the poem as a whole. Secondly, a trochee is what we call a falling foot. We call it a falling foot because we start out on high with the stressed syllable, and then we fall off the cliff of the unstressed syllable. Now thirdly, trochees have various emotional registers. They can be read as panicked and hurried because of that initial first stress, but they can also be read as sad or mournful because of the falling off with that unstressed syllable, that falling rhythm that we talked about. And sad and mournful is precisely what the speaker is going for in this opening quatrain, because the speaker is saying that the young man, despite listening to happy, pleasant music, is himself sad and mournful. Now the next 3 feet in this line are all iambs. But then we get the final foot, which is a 3-syllable foot consisting of an unstressed, a stressed, and then another unstressed syllable. This is a very odd and very rare metrical foot called the amphibrach. You're probably never going to see it again. An amphibrach, as you can see, is also a falling foot because it ends with an unstressed syllable. So, just like the trochee, it reads kind of sad and mournfully. And another thing to note about the amphibrach, just like the trochee, is that when it appears at the end of the line, that line is considered to have a feminine ending. A feminine ending just means that the final syllable of the line is unstressed. Contrast that with a masculine ending, which is when the last syllable of the line is a stressed syllable. Now, most sonnets are written, as we said, in iambic pentameter, which will always end in a stressed syllable. So they're almost always sonnets written with masculine endings. This is yet another way that Shakespeare jolts us in our reading. He ends with a feminine ending rather than a masculine ending. Let's move on to the second line. Here, the meter is just as broken as it is in the first. We begin with a trochee. We follow this up with a spondee, 2 stressed syllables. After that comes a pyrrhic foot, which is 2 unstressed syllables. And then we conclude with 2 iambs. Wild line of poetry. Line 3 continues with the metrical oddities, the metrical disturbances. We start the line off with 2 iambs. That's perfectly normal. But then Shakespeare throws in this dactyl. A dactyl is a 3-syllable metrical foot consisting of 1 stressed and 2 unstressed syllables. Now, when you throw a dactyl into a line of iambs, it's going to read very choppy and erratic, which again is kind of precisely what Shakespeare wants to achieve by disturbing the meter of this quatrain. And then, as if to emphasize this very point, Shakespeare concludes the line with 2 feet of trochees. Note also that this line is hypermetrical. There are 11 syllables. And that brings us to the concluding line of this opening quatrain. And here we find, curiously, that Shakespeare returns to perfect iambic pentameter. Why do you think he does this? Let me know down in the comments. Let's now move to the second quatrain. And just like with the first quatrain, let's paraphrase its message. And then we'll explore how Shakespeare employs the various language arts and literary devices to work in polyphonic harmony with this message. Here's what the speaker says. If the true concord of well-tuned sounds, by unions married, do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. So a good paraphrase of this quatrain might be, if quality music, well played and in harmony, offends you, it's only because you understand that harmony to be rebuking you for not being in harmony in marriage and in the making of a child. So what we have in this quatrain is a continuation of the themes introduced in the first quatrain. The speaker is setting up this contrast between the beautiful music that the young man is listening to and the negative, ugly, emotional response that the young man has to this beautiful music. So it's kind of like a mirror image. We have positive, cheerful music and its reverse, negative, dour emotion. One way that this reversal is represented is that the meter is reversed in the second quatrain as compared to the first. Let's take a look. So really quick to review, what we have in the first quatrain is that the initial 3 lines are disturbed metrically, but in the final line, the iambic pentameter is restored. Here in the second quatrain, however, we get the reverse, again, a mirrored image. Here, it's the first line that is disturbed, whereas the concluding 3 lines of the quatrain all flow along in the familiar musicality of iambic pentameter. The first foot of the line is pyrrhic, that is, it's a 2-syllable foot of 2 unstressed syllables. This is followed by its mirror image, the spondy, which is 2 syllables, both of whose syllables are stressed. And then we get a trochee, which as we know is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. And then we conclude the line with 2 iambs. So for the most part, metrically speaking, this line is mirrored image after mirrored image after mirrored image. So that is how the metrical breakdown of the second quatrain reflects upon the quatrain's message. What then about the diction? How does the diction work in polyphonic harmony with the meter in order to reflect this message? Well, I really can't put it better than the late, great Helen Vendler. I say late, great because unfortunately she recently passed away. Very sad news. She is a wonderful Shakespeare scholar. Her book, I've said this before, her book, The Art of Shakespeare Sonnets, is a must-have for any Shakespeare sonnet enthusiast such as myself. I love it. It's just fantastic in its obsessiveness. And I draw a lot of information from that book for these video lessons. So if you enjoy these video lessons, you're absolutely going to love Helen Vendler's The Art of Shakespeare Sonnets. I'll drop a link to it down in the description. You should definitely pick it up if any of this interests you at all. And all of that aside, once again, rest in peace, Helen. We're going to talk a little bit about the first quatrain in this discussion of the second quatrain because, as I said previously, thematically speaking, they're both linked together. So this is what Helen Vendler has to say about the first quatrain. The rocky disequilibrium of this quatrain could be charted metrically in the initial trochees of the first 2 or 3 lines, and in the spondies of Sweets War Not. Or it could be shown phonetically in the cacophony of Lovest thou that which thou receivest, etc. The metrical and phonetic disequilibrium is meant to enact the dis-ease of bachelorhood. So that's Vendler on the metrical and phonetic nature of the first quatrain. In the second quatrain, as she points out, the equilibrium is restored. Whereas in the first quatrain, we had this cacophony of meter and diction, or at least in terms of diction, we did in the concluding 2 lines of the first quatrain. Here now in the second quatrain, we have a diction of harmony and unity. We see this in the word choices, the diction, unions, married, singleness. And here I believe it makes sense to move along to the third quatrain, because once again, Helen Vendler has a lot of very interesting things to say about the sonnet that, like the dude's rug, really ties the room together. So here we read in the third quatrain, "Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who all in one pleasing note do sing. It's here, isn't it, that the metaphor of polyphony really sings through, doesn't it? After all, what the speaker is saying is that a family, which is composed of individuals with differing personalities, when they come together, they produce a harmonious whole. Just like different strings that produce a different note, when plucked together, are heard to be in harmony. Vendler writes about this quatrain that, quote, "The invention at work in this elaborate conceit of harmony, lines 5 through 14, is the decision to divide music into its three parts: its sounds or aural effect, lines 5 through 8, its strings, lines 9 through 12, and its song or content, lines 13 and 14. So here once again we have this idea of polyphony. The sounds, the strings, the songs, all independent, being played together, produce a harmonious musical metaphor. Beautiful music, composed of different melodic lines, the speaker argues, is akin to the beauty of a unified family composed of varied individuals. Then we have the concluding couplet, which, just like the recapitulation portion of the sonata form, restates the exposition, but with a slight difference. That difference, of course, is that here in the couplet, the speaker makes his argument explicit. Here's what he tells the young man: "Whose speechless song, being many, seeming one, sings this to thee: thou single wilt prove none." I truly love this concluding couplet. Not only do we get this neat tying up of the ideas found in the entire poem, and this is something that we should expect from the couplet of a Shakespearean sonnet, but we also get the use of this word wilt. Wilt is the archaic form of the word will in the present tense second person singular. But wilt can also be used as an intransitive verb, meaning to droop, to become limp, or to fade away, which is exactly what the young man will do if he fails to get married and have children. And though this is a rather harsh ending, a pessimistic ending, there are notes of optimism if you pay attention to the couplet tie. Here we have one of the variations of the verb to sing found in lines 12, 13, and 14. We also have the idea of one found in lines 9, 12, and 13. And finally, we have the word single appear in lines 9 and 14. The speaker's advice to the young man should be absolutely clear by now. Sing as one with a family or die single. So there's hope yet for the young man if he makes the correct decision. And that's our video lesson for William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 8. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. As I said in the introduction, Sonnet No. 8 is probably my favorite of the procreation sonnets. Though to be fair, William is about to go on an absolute tear. He's going to romp about like the 1993 Bulls team. It's a run of excellence, you'll see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In this video lesson, we first read Sonnet No. 8, and then we proceeded to our analysis, where we looked at the poem on a quatrain by quatrain basis, and we examined how Shakespeare used independent English language arts or literary devices to work in polyphonic harmony with his message. Just like composers of polyphony will draw upon independent lines of melody to produce a coherent whole. But just to make sure that we understand everything, let's now turn our attention to some comprehension questions. Number 1. What are your thoughts on this poem? Number 2. What is the message of Sonnet No. 8? Number 3. How does diction support this message? Number 4. How does meter support this message? Number 5. What is an iamb? Number 6. What is a spondee? Number 7. What is a trochee? Number 8. What is an amphibrach? And number 9. What is falling meter, or falling foot? And that completes our video lesson on William Shakespeare's Sonnet No. 8. If you enjoyed this video, please like it. Also consider sharing it on social media. ELA Plus is your YouTube guide to English studies and the English language arts. Subscribe to learn more. I'm Brian E. Denton. Until our next lesson, keep reading and take care of yourselves and others. Thank you.